New York City, February 1975. Inside Electric Lady Studios, the air smelled of cigarette smoke and ambition. David Bowie sat in the control room, watching Luther Vandross lay down background vocals for what would become the Young Americans album. Bowie was in the middle of his plastic soul phase, deliberately crafting a persona that borrowed from American R&B while maintaining the theatrical distance he had perfected over years of reinvention. Ziggy Stardust was dead. Aladdin Sane had vanished. Now Bowie was playing the role of a blue-eyed soul singer with the same calculated precision he brought to everything. He didn't notice Marvin Gaye walk into the studio. Marvin had been invited by one of the session musicians. In 1975, Marvin was in a strange place. Let's Get It On was behind him. His marriage was disintegrating. He moved through the world quietly, watchfully, like someone who had learned that speaking less meant revealing less. When Bowie finally looked up and saw Marvin standing in the corner, something shifted in the room. Bowie stood, extended his hand, and for the next 20 minutes, the two talked. Or rather, Bowie talked. Marvin listened. Bowie was explaining his philosophy: music as theater, the artist as actor, the necessity of transformation. He gestured wildly as he spoke, his voice carrying that distinct mix of English precision and American affectation he had been cultivating. Marvin stood with his hands in his pockets, nodding occasionally, his expression unreadable. And then Bowie said it. "Marvin, you're always just you. Don't you get bored? Music is about transformation. Be someone else. Create a character. Ziggy, Aladdin, anything. Why limit yourself to Marvin Gaye?" The room went quiet. Luther Vandross, who had been warming up his voice in the booth, stopped. The engineer at the mixing board glanced up. Even the cigarette smoke seemed to hang suspended in the air. Marvin looked at Bowie for a long moment, then smiled. Not a warm smile, not a cold smile, just a smile that suggested he had heard this kind of thing before. "Can I use the booth for a minute?" Marvin asked. Bowie nodded, confused but intrigued. Marvin walked into the vocal booth, put on the headphones, and asked the engineer to roll tape. No music, no track, just him and the microphone. And then he started singing. It was a song no one in that room had heard before, a demo version of "I Want You," which wouldn't be released for another year. Marvin's voice came through the speakers, raw and unadorned. There was no production, no arrangement, no backing vocals. Just Marvin, singing about desire and longing and need with a vulnerability that made everyone in the control room forget to breathe. His voice cracked in places. You could hear him take breaths. There were moments where he pushed too hard, moments where he pulled back too much. It wasn't technically perfect, but it was something else entirely. It was naked, completely, terrifyingly naked. Every word felt like a confession. Every note carried weight that had nothing to do with pitch or tone and everything to do with truth. When the song ended, Marvin took off the headphones and walked out of the booth. The control room was silent. Luther Vandross had tears in his eyes. Luther, who would later become one of the most successful R&B artists of his generation, understood technique and vocal control. But what he had just heard wasn't about technique. Years later, he would say that hearing Marvin sing that demo changed how he approached his own music. The engineer stared at the tape machine like it had just performed a miracle. And David Bowie sat very still, his theatrical gestures completely abandoned, his cigarette burning forgotten between his fingers, looking at Marvin like he was seeing him for the first time. Marvin walked over to where Bowie sat. He leaned against the mixing board, arms crossed, and said quietly, "David, I don't need to be anyone else. Being myself is the hardest character to play." Then he nodded to everyone in the room and left. To understand why that moment shattered something in David Bowie, you need to understand what Bowie had built his entire career on: reinvention, transformation, the idea that the artist was separate from the art, that you could put on a mask and become anything you wanted. Bowie had spent years perfecting this philosophy, moving from glam rock to plastic soul to whatever would come next, always one step ahead of himself, always creating distance between David Jones and whoever he was pretending to be this week. And it had worked. Bowie was one of the most successful artists in the world. His ability to shapeshift, to anticipate trends, to create characters that captured the zeitgeist had made him a legend. But it had also made him safe. The masks protected him. They allowed him to sing about pain, alienation, desire, all while maintaining a buffer between the performance and the performer. Ziggy could be vulnerable. Aladdin could be broken. But David was always in control, always watching from behind the curtain. Marvin Gaye had no curtain. When he sang, you weren't hearing a character. You were hearing him, all of him, the insecurity, the loneliness, the desire, the pain. There was no distance, no theatrical buffer. And that terrified Bowie because it suggested that everything he had built, all the personas and reinventions and careful constructions, might be a form of cowardice. The session continued after Marvin left, but something had changed. Luther kept stopping between takes, shaking his head, muttering that he needed to rethink his approach. The engineer played back Marvin's recording twice more, discovering new layers each time. The way Marvin's voice caught on certain words, the almost imperceptible breath before the most vulnerable lines. And Bowie sat quietly, smoking, saying nothing. Everyone in that room understood they had just witnessed something rare. That night, Bowie went back to his hotel room and listened to every Marvin Gaye record he owned. What's going on? Let's get it on. The Tammy Terrell duets. He listened for the technique, for the craft. But what he heard was a man who had turned his entire life into music without mediation. No character, no mask, just Marvin. Every vocal crack, every breath, every moment where Marvin's voice seemed to almost break. These weren't flaws. They were the entire point. Bowie sat until sunrise, smoking, listening, and feeling something he rarely allowed himself to feel. Doubt about whether all the reinvention had been a kind of elaborate avoidance. In interviews over the following weeks, Bowie started talking differently about the Young Americans album. He had originally framed it as a playful experiment, him trying on American soul music the way he had tried on glam rock and science fiction. But now he started using different words. Honesty, vulnerability, connection. The journalist noticed but didn't understand why the usually articulate Bowie seemed to be struggling to explain what he was trying to do. Years later, in 2003, long after Marvin was dead and Bowie had gone through countless other reinventions, a journalist asked him about influences he didn't talk about often. Bowie was quiet for a moment, then said, "I met Marvin Gaye once, briefly, in a studio in New York, and he did something that I've spent my entire career avoiding. He just was. No performance, no distance, just complete terrifying honesty. I watched him sing one song, and I realized that I had built a career on masks because I was afraid to do what he did every single time he stepped to a microphone." The interviewer pressed him. What was he afraid of? Bowie smiled, that same theatrical smile he had been using for decades. Being seen, really seen, not as Ziggy or the Thin White Duke or any of the characters, just as myself. Marvin showed me that being yourself, completely and without protection, is the bravest thing an artist can do. And I'm still not sure I'm brave enough. The recording Marvin made that day in Electric Lady Studios was never officially released. The engineer kept a copy, and over the years it circulated among musicians and producers who understood what they were hearing. The quality was poor, just a rough vocal take with no accompaniment, recorded on equipment that was set up for monitoring rather than final production. There was hiss on the tape. The levels weren't properly balanced. By any technical standard, it was a failed recording. But everyone who heard it said the same thing. It was one of the most powerful recordings Marvin ever made, precisely because it was so stripped down, so unprotected, no strings to sweeten the emotion, no backing vocals to fill the empty spaces, no production tricks to hide behind. Just Marvin's voice, naked and alone, saying things he could barely say in conversation. One producer who heard the tape years later described it as listening to someone's therapy session set to melody. Another said it made him uncomfortable, like he was witnessing something too private to be shared. But no one who heard it ever forgot it. When I Want You was finally released in 1976, it was heavily produced, layered with strings and backing vocals and all the lush arrangement that Motown had perfected. It was beautiful. It was sensual. It was a masterpiece. But the people who had heard the demo that day in Electric Lady Studios always felt like something had been lost in translation. The album version was perfect. The demo had been true. David Bowie continued to create characters, continued to reinvent himself, continued to maintain that careful distance between the performer and the performance. The Thin White Duke emerged later that same year, even more theatrical, even more detached than what came before. But something had shifted after that day in the studio, though it would take years to become visible. His later work, particularly the albums from the late 1990s and early 2000s, showed glimpses of something different. Moments where the mask slipped. Moments where you could hear David Jones underneath all the construction. They were brief, and Bowie always pulled back quickly, retreating to the safety of performance and artifice. But they were there. Songs like Thursday's Child or The Next Day carried a weight, a directness that his earlier work had deliberately avoided. Some critics noticed. They wrote about a new maturity in Bowie's work, a willingness to be vulnerable that hadn't been there before. But they didn't know about that day in Electric Lady Studios. They didn't know about the 20-minute conversation about mass and authenticity. They didn't know about Marvin Gaye standing alone in a vocal booth, singing the truth of his life without protection or pretense. In the mythology of music history, David Bowie and Marvin Gaye exist in different universes. One was the chameleon, the shapeshifter, the artist as perpetual reinvention. The other was the tortured soul, the man who turned his pain into music without mediation. But for 20 minutes in a New York recording studio in 1975, those universes intersected. And what happened in that intersection changed how one of the most successful artists in the world thought about his own work. Marvin never talked about the incident. He probably didn't think it was important. For him, what he did in that booth was just what he always did. Sing, no character, no performance, just the truth of who he was at that moment. The fact that it shook someone like David Bowie wouldn't have surprised him, but it wouldn't have particularly impressed him either. Marvin knew what he was doing was difficult. He just didn't know how to do it any other way. The question that haunts anyone who studies this moment is simple. Which approach was right? Bowie's method gave him longevity, adaptability, the ability to survive in an industry that destroyed artists who couldn't change. He lived to 69, created until the very end, maintained control over his image and legacy right up until his death in 2016. Marvin's method gave him authenticity, depth, a body of work that felt like direct access to a human soul. Songs that didn't just entertain but revealed. Music that cost him something every time he made it, but it also destroyed him. Being that vulnerable, that exposed, that honest, came with a cost that Marvin paid every day of his life. The drugs, the paranoia, the inability to separate his art from his pain, all of it led to that morning in 1984 when his father pulled the trigger. Maybe Bowie was right to keep his distance. Maybe the masks were protection, a necessary buffer between the artist and the world that wanted to consume him. Self-preservation through performance. Maybe that's not cowardice but wisdom. Or maybe Marvin was right, and the only music worth making is the music that costs you something, that requires you to stand naked in front of the world and let them see everything, including the parts you wish they couldn't see. Maybe that's the price of truth, and maybe it's worth paying even if it kills you. There's no answer, just two artists, two philosophies, and one afternoon in a recording studio where they briefly understood each other completely, even as they realized they could never do what the other did. Bowie couldn't take off the mask. Marvin couldn't put one on. And both of them, in their own way, paid the price for their choice. The recording remains. Somewhere in someone's archive, that demo version of I Want You still exists. Just Marvin's voice, raw and unadorned, singing about desire and need and longing. No character, no persona, no distance. Just a man, singing the truth of his life. And everyone who heard it that day knew they had witnessed something rare. The moment when art and artist became the same thing, when the mask disappeared completely, when there was nothing left but honesty. The moment when one of the most theatrical artists in music history realized that the bravest thing you can do is not to reinvent yourself, but to reveal yourself. For David Bowie, sitting in that control room, Watching a man do something he had spent his entire career avoiding, it was the beginning of a question he would spend the rest of his life trying to answer. What if the bravest thing you can do is stop pretending? He never fully answered that question. He died still wearing masks, still creating characters, still maintaining that careful distance. But in his final album, Black Star, released just days before his death, there were moments, brief flashes where you could hear David Jones, sick and dying, saying goodbye. No Ziggy, no Duke, just a man facing the end. Maybe Marvin Gaye somewhere would have recognized those moments, would have heard in them the same thing he had tried to show Bowie in that studio 40 years earlier. That being yourself, completely and without protection, is the most terrifying and necessary thing an artist can do. The masks keep you safe, but the truth sets you free. And sometimes, for just a moment, in a recording studio in New York, two artists understood both things at once.